With oil painting, I've always used two main approaches in my process. The first being what I shared in the previous video, which is primarily 2 layers of paint, possibly a third to add the finishing details, where I pretty much use the first layer as a block-in stage to sort of create a template for myself. And then in the second layer, I add more paint, get more physical texture, and really try to finalize and finish everything. The second method that I use in my process is more like an Alla Prima approach, where I try to get as much as I can finished within the first layer of paint. And then I pretty much always use a second layer of paint to go back in and really finalize. So the difference between the two is one allows me to be a little more careful in my approach. And for the longest time, I thought that that was primarily the better route for me to take anyways. But more recently, I've been using this method where I really try to just, like I said, tackle everything in the first pass. So in this video, I'm going to kind of walk you through this painting, which I'm using this more Alla Prima approach, and just kind of walk you through my thoughts on that. So this scene was from a spot that I spent some time at this past fall. And the way that the light came over the mountainside as the sun was setting just captured this particular spot perfectly. So I thought this was just a really good study to dig into this whole process and this whole means of trying to figure out what is best for me. And that's an ongoing process. And that's what I touched in the last video, how I'm always trying to study and experiment with different things. And so as I returned from being away for quite a while, I started to think about getting back into the larger painting that I have half finished, and just trying to not only get myself comfortable with the paint again, but to try and challenge my thought process and to see if I can't come up with anything that will better the results of my work moving forward, I guess. And so I would say that I'm more comfortable painting in layers. This is definitely more of a challenging approach in that you really have to push yourself to get things to look right before moving on. And it takes a lot more discipline to sit in front of the easel for an extended period of time. So this particular method, just really trying to go for it all at once. It's much more similar to a plein air style painting, where you really don't have time to take breaks and come back to it at later. You have to finish everything as quickly as you can with what time allows. But at the same time, that's also a good thing, as that sort of pressure really gets you to open up a little bit in your style. It really gets you to forget about some of the specifics and let the paint flow and let the brush speak for itself more so. So when I'm taking this approach, it's important for me to move fast and to really bounce around on the surface overall and try and get a lot of the shadows established and a lot of the highlights established very early on. And then I'll try to fill in as much as I can with colors that seem to fit the bill about right in the center of what it is I'm trying to portray. So I usually try to pick something somewhat in the middle and then try to fill in the area. And the main objective with this first pass of paint is to just really get the whole surface covered. So a lot of times I'll kind of forget about things, move on to the other areas, try to fill in those spots, and I'm just not worried about the quality. I'm more so worried about the values, the color, the contrast, and the composition. Now, in this particular painting, when you have a very smooth, soft-looking sky like this, with these trees that sort of just abruptly protrude into the sky, it can be difficult around those transition areas. So you see me leave some gaps around the trees, and the reason for that is you've got a dark tree and basically a white sky behind it, and those two really don't mix. And so that's the one part of trying to paint wet paint. Those colors can get very muddy and very sloppy, and your details can end up looking very poorly. And that can happen really quick if you're not careful. So I've learned to take this approach with the sky of essentially going around the areas where I know there's going to be a tree, and then just adding a little bit of hint of the tree trunk and the branches protruding up into it. But then you can see that color of the blank surface behind it, that little bit of burnt sienna of from my gesso and primer. You can see that showing through, and I didn't cover it up completely. And I actually won't cover that up until the second layer, because it's such a very sensitive area, and it can just really get sloppy fast. So the one exception to all this is when it comes to these trees and all of the details within it, when they protrude into the sky, I haven't really found a solution with that yet, so I'm very cautious, and that's one area that I typically leave for the second layer of paint. Aside from the sky, the rest of the painting is a lot of rough textures when you think about it. A lot of rough patterns. All these different pine boughs and highlights and shadows. They have very hard edges. There's not a lot of soft blending. And you can really use the thickness of the paint to change and cover up and adjust as you go. And so if I add something that I'm not happy with, I can just scoop up some thicker paint, bring it over the top of that, and it usually covers it up pretty easily. And with pine trees and grass and things like this in the foreground, it's not easily screwed up. And so it's not as difficult. It can be a little bit more relaxing for me. And when I'm trying to paint things like pine boughs, especially as it gets closer to the viewer, I'm just basically worried about the general shapes and patterns as a whole. I'm not looking at specific pine needles. I'm not thinking about the small twigs. I'm just trying to get the pattern established that gives you the idea of a pine tree or a pine bough. So for the most part, I use the paintbrush that I typically use for my plein air painting. It's just a small angled flat brush. It's about 1/4 inch wide, and it has just a good sharp edge to it. So it allows me to get those nice crisp patterns. It creates, basically little rectangular shapes in with each brush stroke. And that can be really good for things like pine boughs because the patterns are very similar. So when it comes to this first layer paint, I used a lot of this brush, and then I switched to the Dagger Striper brush for the second layer of paint. But I'm nearing the end of this first layer, and the only difference between this and the previous painting where I set it up for more so adding most of the detail within the second layer of paint and not the first layer like this, the only real difference is that I use a lot thicker paint with something like this. And I'm really trying to exhibit all of those heavy textures of paint within this first pass. And that's where the majority of the work is done. And a lot of this painting, the other main difference is that a lot of this does not get covered up with the second layer of paint versus the previous painting I did. The entire surface was essentially repainted. And so that to me is the difference between a layering approach versus more of a wet on wet approach. But I still do like to layer. I like to glaze. I like to enhance some of the highlights. It can just be really difficult overall to get your highlights to be as bright as you want them to be and your shadows to be as dark as you want them to be, because when you're painting and working with wet paint like this, things can all start to blend together. And so those highlights start to get muted down a little bit, and some of those shadows start to get lifted up a little bit. And so that's just kind of the one thing that is different about the two approaches. Now, when I get down into the foreground and I get into some of the grass, you can see that I've switched to the Dagger Striper brush for this. So I'm not very particular about what brush I use. I just want to use the brush that works for me. So when it comes to transitioning from the pine boughs and the trees to the grass, the dagger striper is really a better tool for things like grass, because that sharp point really enables you to add that texture that feels like a lot of stalks, and it gives you the feeling of all those grass heads. And the more of that texture that you can build, the more realistic that grass is going to feel. And so I like to use that brush for just a little more control for an area like that, as well as when I get to some of the finer details like on the horizon like this. And so I've got pine trees that sort of scale that mountainside up in the distance, and those are very small particular details, and this brush is just really good to remain controlled. And I also have to be careful to not blend that color into the trees, vice versa. And so once I've kind of got everything established and I'm feeling pretty good about it, this is when I start to think about refining some of the things that I've done. And I start going back and using the tip of this brush, which is normally what I'd be doing in the second layer paint if I took that approach. But I'll go back in while the paint is all still wet here, and I'll really just try to add some of those specific details that I know I want to exist in the painting, and there's really no way around it other than to just get your feet wet and to start making it an attempt to getting these on there. And it can be an intimidating and difficult thing when you're painting with wet paint like that, but I try to get as far as I can to just give myself a head start to now the second layer of paint which I'm on. So now that everything's dried, I oiled it out, I'm just thinking about some of those details that really bring life into the scene overall. So I want some branches hanging overhead. It can kind of frame up the painting nice, add some depth, kind of gives you some perspective of things in your immediate surroundings. And then I want to work a lot on the light source. And you can get just so far when you're painting Alla Prima, when you're trying to create these bright light sources. The magic really occurs with that next layer of paint, because you're allowed to sort of glaze some colors over the top. You're allowed to saturate some of those colors more and brighten some of those colors up, crispen up some of the details, and just really focus on the light itself rather than the pine tree. And I think the key for something like this, creating a nice light source, is really taking your time with it and understanding that the bright yellows and oranges need to be very close to your light source. And then as you get further away, you need to switch to more of the reds and the magentas fairly quick, or else it's going to start to look a little bit green. So it's hard to transition those light sources, and I've talked about this in a lot of the videos. Once you get into that orange spectrum and it starts to go into the red and fades away, it can get green very easily. So I really try to pull out some of those magentas, but there really is no special trick to that. It's just about making sure that your organization of the colors, the yellows, oranges, reds, and then into some of the greens and shadows are, appropriately laid out. So now when it came to just finalizing some of the trees on the horizon on the right side of the painting, I use this dagger striper brush to try and match some of the color that exists into the sky. And then I just try to paint the negative space into the trees. And you can see it already looks much more realistic. The trees really start to stand out, and you can start to picture yourself there at the scene almost immediately when some of the negative space starts showing through these trees on the horizon. So this is why I like to wait to finalize spots like this until the end of my work and into the second layer of paint, because it really is easy once you let it dry to create nice realistic trees like this, and it just really helps you avoid some major problems that you can face when you're trying to paint wet on wet. So overall, I think that looking at both of these paintings and how they went for me, I think this was just a good reminder for myself that this particular method is really the best method for me. And I think moving forward, I'm going to try and keep using this technique as much as I can. I think when I take more of a conservative approach and try to layer, it actually slows me down. It actually can create more work for me. And so I would recommend that if you're feeling like your work can take a long time, or you're running into some other blending problems or different things like that, you're just not getting the results, I would really recommend trying to paint more of an Alla Prima approach. And that can be very challenging. It can be more intimidating, and it can oftentimes get you to second guess what you're doing. But I think putting pressure on yourself like that and really going for it can blossom some really great results in your work. And I think you'll find that if you take the plunge and try to get as much as you can done within one layer of paint, that you'll find that you might even take away more from that painting or learn more, because it really forces you to get involved with the paint more in a hands-on way than painting in layers, which that conservativeness can just be limiting in how much you're able to learn and take away. So overall, I think this piece came out just perfectly. It really brought me back to this location, and I thought it's just a great study to do. And it's already giving me ideas for future paintings and ideas that I can incorporate into some of the upcoming paintings that I have planned. So I hope that you found this helpful. And again, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.